Bet the Board.
What do you mean you don't bet? I mean, I don't bet. You know, I don't gamble. I don't. I never have, and I never will. Yeah, right. I'll bet you $20 I can get you gambling before the end of the day.
You owe me 15 grand, pal.
Pay him. Pay that man his money.
It's the Bet the Board podcast.
God likes me. He really, really likes me.
In the end, I wound up right back where I started. I could still pick winners, and I could still make money for all kinds of people back home. And why mess up a good thing?
Here's Payne Insider and Todd Furman.
Welcome into the Bet the Board podcast. College football week 12. We inch closer to the culmination of the regular season and championship Saturday. I'm your host, Todd Furman, joined as always by my esteemed colleague and co-host, the one, the only Payne Insider. And Payne, last week when we talked about college football week 11, you told me you were scared about the trip to Central New York for your Florida State Seminoles. They look like the hottest thing in the country right now, and if it wasn't for a couple of early season collapses, maybe they'd have a chance to win the ACC championship.
I would like to see them healthy against that 3-game stretch they had. That was the time of the season where they had all the injuries along the defensive line, offensive line. They are healthy right now, and man, they played that series of Wake, Clemson, NC State. Not going to say 12-0, but and they wouldn't have been a good 12-0 team. But might have been the worst 12-0 team in the history of college football. However, they are playing much better, and you're starting to kind of see the build and the process. This was, if there was 5 feet of shit, Florida State was beneath that based upon how things transpired, right? And you've heard me talk about it before, but you have Jimbo, who basically all but quit the final 18 months there. You get Willie Taggart in a transition class during an early signing period, and he's the least organized human known to mankind. And then you have Mike come in. It's another transition class and an early signing period. In the first year, he gets hit with COVID, so he can't go out on the recruiting trail. And then you don't start like a house on fire, which is ultimately the igniter in college football. And you see it transpiring right now, right? LSU is the hottest thing on the recruiting trail right now because in year one, if you can win in year one, when that new car smell is on, it just becomes an igniter, man. And Mike Norvell did not have that. And so this has just been kind of the slow build.
Yeah, and you know what? Maybe we'll get lucky. Maybe we'll get Florida State, TCU in a bowl game, and we'll get the market to overreact, and we'll all be Florida State Seminoles for one day in late December. College football playoff rankings were revealed last night. We'll get to those with Brad Powers, but we have a ton of ground to cover, so we may as well welcome in the third member of the Holy Trinity. He joins us every Wednesday here on the Bet the Board podcast. You, of course, can follow Brad Powers on Twitter at BradPower7. And Brad, the first question I have to ask you on a Wednesday morning, are you still celebrating your alma mater, Bowling Green, getting bowl eligible for the first time in what feels like 35 years and getting a rare outright upset against Toledo in the Battle of I-75?
I am celebrating because, I mean, obviously where I come from, I grew up right in between Bowling Green and Toledo. Decided to go to BG because they had my major, journalism, more than Toledo did. I did celebrate. That is a big rivalry. That is a big win. They've few and far between in the last 15 years between BG and Toledo. I was pretty happy. First time in 7 years, BG's bowl eligible.
Pretty impressive when you look at what the Falcons have been able to accomplish, going well over their win total, and now maybe being a little bit of a dark horse to actually have a chance to win the Mid-American Conference. We'll see exactly what happens there. But gentlemen, we had yet another unveiling last night of the college football shenanigans, playoff show, whatever the hell you want to call it. You have to imagine the picture is getting significantly clearer here. We know who the top 3 teams in the country are. We know who the top 4 are, I guess, if you throw TCU in there. But that's a different discussion for a different day, as everybody potentially wins and jockeys for position. Brad, when you look at that, were there any things that surprised you or that our listeners might find fascinating in terms of how you might have a couple of these teams power rated? Say, for example, Tennessee against TCU on a neutral field.
Yeah, I think there's 5 teams as far as power ratings go that have separated themselves from the rest of college football. Obviously, Georgia, Ohio State at the top. Believe it or not, Alabama is still one of those 5 teams. And then Tennessee and Michigan are the other 2 there. And then, the drop-off after Tennessee, Michigan's like a touchdown down to your Penn States and the TCUs of the world. So right now in a neutral, I would have Tennessee about a 7.5, 8-point favorite over TCU, even though I upgraded TCU significantly. Last week's performance, I hate to bring it up, and Payne told me that I shouldn't as least as possible. That was the most impressive performance by TCU last week. It just in hostile territory. When you watch that game flow, I was super impressed with what they did last week. So that's even after a big upgrade. I still think they're significantly worse than other teams at the top.
And TCU will indeed have their hands full this weekend when you look at the market, a game we'll get to a little bit later in the show. Payne, can I interest you in picking a side in the fictitious matchup between TCU and Tennessee? I mean, to keep these bragging rights discussions going between you and Brad?
Well, you conned me into this discussion last week. You got me in a rare form, and we had this battle of Oregon and Tennessee, and what happens? It plays itself out on the field. So I hate doing this type of this conversation. You sucked me in last week. You got me good. Yes, Tennessee, we would make this morning 7.5 over TCU. I was impressed with what TCU did defensively, specifically slowing down the Texas ground game. That was one of the biggest matchup advantages on paper. You got buy-in from TCU up front. Not quite sure what Sark was doing offensively. Quinn Ewers appeared to be the guy that was in camp battles with Hudson Card all offseason. I can't believe we didn't see Hudson Card for a series or two, knowing how important that game was. And I know we talked off air, but that was probably the biggest game in the Sark era to this point when you think about the recruits that were there in attendance for a game like that. And it's tough to score 0 offensive points when you're an offensive-minded guy.
Yeah, spoiler alert, Texas fans, you're not getting a deep dive against Kansas this weekend. You guys need to bounce back and show us something that you can be a relevant football program with a Big 12 championship aspirations.
I think we're all pretty sick here. I think we're all pretty sickos here. I can't personally do it, but my number's substantially higher on Texas this week than what the line's indicating.
It's not going to be about talent for their trip to Lawrence. Let's put it that way. If Texas wants to be there and wants to try and go out there and play 4 full quarters, they'll be able to name the score. You begin to wonder what's going on between the ears of some of those Longhorn football players, knowing that getting to the conference championship appears to be a little bit of a pipe dream without significant help. But all right, guys, we may as well get into a couple of the games. We got a lot of ground to cover, and you talk about disappointments. What we saw from the Fighting Illini last weekend at home against Purdue was disappointing for a variety of other reasons. A team that appeared to once be in control of their own destiny in the Big Ten West now has lost back-to-back games, and going on the road to the Big House to take on Michigan, things aren't going to get any easier. Michigan, a 17.5-point favorite in this matchup. Total in the game sits at 42. Senior day at the Big House. I know, Payne, you're a huge fan of nostalgia in the grand scheme of things. 2 of the nation's top-scoring defenses will be on display. Michigan holding their opponents to under 12 points per game. Illinois a shade worse at 12.5. You look at Michigan, they've now won 17 straight games as double-digit favorites, and they've gone 11-6 against the number in those 17 games. The last loss coming against in-state rival Michigan State as a 21.5-point favorite. The Illini, they've been good as an underdog covering their last 4. Yes, I know it's an extremely small sample size. Brad, when you look at the Illini, we knew this was a team that had overachieved coming into the year. I'm not sure anybody anticipated that they would lose outright to Michigan State and follow it up with another semi-dud against Purdue. As far as their overall power number this season, what kind of roller coaster have Illini fans been on since the start of the season?
Yeah, so obviously overall up significantly. I have upgraded Illinois 10.5 points since the start of the season. But at their high point, that number was above 2 touchdowns just a few weeks ago prior to the last 2 games. And obviously a lot of it has to do with performance, losing outright as a favorite back-to-back weeks. I know we're going to get into it. The other half of that downgrade is significant injuries for a team on both sides of the ball that lacks a little bit of depth. I mean, this is only year 2 of Bielema. He hasn't gotten all the recruiting classes together, and it was a team that lost a lot of guys. They were a very senior-laden team a year ago. So, yeah, this was a team that was borderline top 15 in my power rankings a couple weeks ago. Now I got them number 26 in my power ratings.
And you mentioned some of those injuries. There's no doubt we'll talk about those in terms of what kind of impact it could have on the Fighting Illini, especially their ability to run the football. So I guess, Payne, the logical segue comes there. I mean, when you look at these two teams, Michigan 10-0 for the first time under Coach Harbaugh. You try and find their signature win so far this year, and I guess it's the win over Penn State, 41-17. The resume leaves a lot to be desired, although if we were having this discussion about 6 weeks ago, you never would have said that beating UConn early in the year was going to open people's eyes. When you look at this on-field matchup and try and figure out a path for Illinois to stay inside the number and keep this game competitive, is it along that defensive line and their ability to slow down Blake Corum, or is it hoping that Tommy DeVito and a banged-up backfield can move the football against the Michigan defense that we all thought was going to take a step back, but for certain stretches this year has looked as dynamic as the group we saw last year that got them to the college football playoff?
Good old Tommy DeVito, my guy. The first thing when you look at this game from a core number perspective, it's nearly impossible to get to 18. Yep. And then you factor in that number with a total of 41.5. And I think that ultimately lends itself to being pretty attractive to numbers, guys. But for Illinois to cover this, right, it comes down to their strength. It's got to be the defense. And we'll see if that unit wears down, but ultimately that's the strength of this team. Illinois has to come out and play their best game of the season on that side of the ball, because I can't see the Illini offense contributing all that much with Chase Brown out or far less than 100% against a Michigan defense that's, top 15 in schedule adjusted rush efficiency and EPA per rush allowed. It's not a good matchup to begin with. So, and then you mentioned DeVito, right? In that receiver group, they don't really have the ability to be explosive through the air either. They're outside the top 90 in both schedule adjusted explosiveness and EPA per pass. So this is very much an offense that relies on its ground game, and their horse is, potentially in the stable this week. I think when you look at this to cover the number, Illinois' defense has to hold Michigan to 28 or less. Maybe create a short field for its offense or even manufacture some points on their own. I know Blake Corum is playing at a level where he should be invited, I think, to New York. And if you look at wins above an average player for all non-quarterbacks in the entire country, Blake Corum's number one. But the one thing we talked about in the offseason about Michigan's offense would be their ability, once it got a little bit colder, once they stepped up in class, if they could be as physical a running team as they were last year, because they relied heavily on Hassan Haskins in matchups like this. And so let's see if Blake Corum can be that physical runner in a game like this. If he can't, then Illinois' defense has a chance to keep this within the number. The Illini defensive line is, you kind of hinted at it, it's fantastic, right? I mean, it's led to a defense that's top 5 in schedule adjusted rushing success rate allowed, EPA per rush allowed, and power rushing allowed. If you can stop the Michigan run game and force J.J. McCarthy in the passing attack to beat you, that's the way to go about this. Because if you've been watching the last few weeks, it's been kind of struggle bus for the Wolverines through the air. J.J. McCarthy's completed 47% of his passes the last 2 weeks against Rutgers and Nebraska. And if you look specifically to the Nebraska matchup, I know the scoreboard said something different, but when J.J. McCarthy faced man coverage, an 11% passing success rate. So this is, to me, very much a step up in class for Michigan's offense. They've played a schedule of defenses that have an average efficiency rank of 66th. Illinois, now top 10. Now, you guys hit this perfectly in that there's some injuries, and it's not just Brown on the offensive side. Illinois lost its number 2 corner in Taz in the game against Purdue. They were down their 3rd-string corner coming into that game. So something to think about there. But if you think about maybe Michigan getting on track through the air, you kind of look at the weather here, right? Right now, about 19 mile per hour winds, gusts into the high 20s, right? The 20 degrees, right? It could hinder Michigan's ability to pass even more than what we've seen the last few weeks, to where those injuries in Illini's secondary might not be as impactful, right? It's just, this is an interesting game, right? It's 2 very slow-paced teams, both outside the top 90 in plays per minute. This just feels like Big Ten football in November, and I can absolutely see why all the 45, 44 and a halfs and even 45 and a halfs that were out there have been just completely wiped from the market.
Yeah, you mentioned some of the injuries for the Fighting Illini. Michigan may potentially get some reinforcements back for them on the offensive side. We'll keep tabs on their tight end, Luke Schoonmaker, and Donovan Edwards, who ended up leaving the game early against Nebraska. I did find it interesting, guys, when you do some reading on Michigan leading up to this game. Ronnie Bell is talking about more practice and more reps, trying to get their timing down in the passing attack. I mean, Brad, are they going to get their timing down 24 hours before they play Ohio State, or what the hell are they waiting for through the first 10 games of the season to try and get J.J. McCarthy on track?
And, I mean, they've obviously had opportunities considering the competition that they face. So, I mean, they should have been able to work on it even during games, to be perfectly frank with you. So that is not necessarily the big concern here, but certainly it will be next week when they're going to have to make some plays down the field. I just want to concur with Payne. When I'm betting on Sundays, it's pure numbers based. And to me, full body of work, I mean, lends itself to Illinois under. I can confirm that I took those two positions, under being the stronger of the two.
There is no doubt a correlation between the two. If the Illini's defense shows up, going to be extremely challenging for Michigan to get outside the number. Something that they had to work hard on last Saturday against Nebraska, electing to kick a late field goal to take it from a 31-3 margin to 34-3. So anybody out there who's telling me Coach Harbaugh doesn't know the numbers, they're completely full of shit, because we saw the trick plays they ran against Michigan State as well to try and get them to cover late against their in-state rival. Just something you may want to keep tabs on if it's hanging around the number deep into the fourth quarter. But if you guys like offense in the Big Ten, well, you're going to love Michigan-Illinois compared to the next game we have on the docket, and that, of course, is the showdown in the Twin Cities between Iowa and Minnesota. You're looking at the Golden Gophers, a field goal favorite, up a touch from where it was opened in that 2.5 range. One of the lowest totals you're ever going to see in the FBS. Right now at 32. Should be a battle of sheer wills between these teams. Game day forecast in Minneapolis for kickoff. High of 18 degrees with flurries in the morning. Not exactly optimal offensive weather. When you look at Iowa, they've won 7 straight against the Golden Gophers. Won the last 2 meetings in Minneapolis by double digits, including a 35-7 victory back in 2020. Iowa survived last year in Kinnick Stadium with a 27-22 win. Thank you, Kirk Ferentz, for kicking a field goal inside the 5-yard line. It allowed all of us around Bet the Board to cash Minnesota as an underdog at +6 or better. Brad, when you look at this total, can you create a little bit of historical perspective about how low this is for 2 Power 5 conference members to do battle this late in the year?
Yeah, so the database that I use goes back 40 years on sides, about 20 years on totals. And between FBS opponents, this is the lowest total we've seen in the last 20 years between a pair of FBS teams. So historically low. I will say this, because I do bet FCS too. I do like action. I've seen a lot of these low totals here in the last couple of years at the FCS. And believe it or not, I know that there's this old adage, you bet under the lowest total on the board, you bet over the highest total on the board. Not the case. I'm betting usually over on these very low totals. And, I mean, if you look at totals 33 and lower, 10-1 to the over. So there gets to a point. I don't care how cold it is and how, defensive-oriented and rush-heavy that these teams are. There gets a point in today's day and age in college football where you can go a little too low for a total, where you almost need the perfect setup to cash an under ticket. And I mean, I'm not going to beat around the bush. I did play a little over on the open, even though it hasn't moved.
You know what? I mean, PJ Fleck even addressed it in some of his comments this week about how Iowa's defense is better at creating offense than Iowa's offense in not so many words. And we saw that last week in their win against Wisconsin. The biggest plays came on special teams to create a short field. You got a punt return. You got a pick six. So there's a variety of different things that Iowa can do. And to your point, when you're going under 32, you need the game played between the 20s. You need long, methodical drives and no turnovers in plus territory. Now, I know, Payne, we vowed around here that we wouldn't talk about another Iowa football game after we did the Cyhawk showdown early in the year at 10-7, but Iowa's shown a little bit more fight each of the last 2 weeks. They've taken professional money in their win in West Lafayette against Purdue, and even last week they did against Wisconsin. While their offense looked inept, the defense bailed them out a little bit. When you begin to look at the Hawkeyes under their current construct, is there more reason for optimism offensively, or do you think yet again it's going to have to be selling out to stop the run of Mo Ibrahim and Iowa's path to potential victory, should there be one in this game?
That's the only reason we're talking about Iowa right now, is quietly they've done well for us the last 2 weeks. And, we're not trying to create a bunch of jokes about this game, but the total is certainly laughable, and you can understand how we get there when you have 2 top 7 defenses and 2 bottom 70 offenses, and they both play like snails, and there's questions about one of the starting quarterbacks, and there's freezing temps. But to your guys' point, I mean, you just pass gas the wrong way, and this thing could sneak over. I look at this.
Hell of an analogy you're creating for us, by the way, giving our listeners a comfortable visual. But continue.
So, I mean, Iowa's faced the far tougher schedule. But when you start to adjust for those schedule discrepancies, Minnesota's actually been the better team, despite some key cogs missing time. And I think that's ultimately the advantage that Minnesota could have. And this line, to me, says that Tanner Morgan is possibly out there. And so that's interesting to me. The way Iowa's playing, reading this market, it would tell me, Minnesota's the side. Haven't bet it, but I think when we go back to that last year's game that you mentioned, we saw Kai Thomas and Bucky Irving went for over 200 yards combined. And this time it's a healthy Mo Ibrahim. And as great as Iowa's defense has been, they've actually been beat up on the ground a little bit, right? They're not like this immovable object, right? They're not impenetrable. Iowa's defense is actually outside the top 50 in defensive line yards. So you can move them more than we've typically seen out of Iowa defenses, and maybe it's, the strength and conditioning coach that's moved on. I don't know. But it's led to opposing offenses being successful in more than 43% of their rush attempts. That's barely inside the top 60. Minnesota's offensive line, that's just been the strength of their team for the last couple of years. I know they lost some guys this year, but again, they're back in top 10 in creating yards, right? It's led to 51% of rush attempts grading successful. That's a top 15 rate in the country. So to me, that's the biggest matchup discrepancy on paper in this game. And part of it is schematic. When you start to maybe project ahead and figure out what Iowa's defense is going to do, you just look to their defensive coordinator, Phil Parker, and like everything else on this team, I know it's a great defense, but he is also uber conservative. It's not a shock, right? He has guys sit back in their 2 high shell zone, and if Mo is pounding you for 5 a pop, is Iowa going to be willing to adjust defensively? It's something they really haven't done. So let's see if they ultimately are forced to change the way they play their defense. And I think that's potentially where Tanner Morgan could be important, because if Minnesota's getting it going on the ground and Iowa does adapt and adjust and put more guys in the box, then you need Tanner Morgan to be able to push it downfield a little bit. And I think he is the better passer, even though he hasn't been great this season. But ultimately, to me, that's the biggest thing here. Is it would look like, based upon last year's matchup, based on what we're seeing from these teams this season with the eye test and both metrically, Minnesota should have an advantage running the ball here.
The one question I'll throw back to you guys, and Brad or Payne, whichever one of you wants to add a little bit of context. The one unit that I'm honestly most curious about, that I'm not sure how to grade them so far this season, would be Minnesota's defense. You look at what they've done against inferior opponents. They've obviously carried their lunch pail and made life easy on the offense. But is when they step up in class, and I use that term relatively speaking within the Big Ten West, because you're not exactly hit with high-powered passing attacks, do you guys believe they're as good as some of their season-long numbers suggest? I go back to the Illinois game, and I guess it's not fair to necessarily use one data point, but the Illini were able to move Minnesota around, and that was with Tommy DeVito, who was extremely limited with the ankle injury in a game that we didn't think he was even going to play.
In a word, no. And I'll do the 100 level, and I'll let Professor Payne take it a couple notches further. They lost a lot of leadership off last year's team. I am a big believer, though, in their defensive coordinator, Joe Rossi. I think he's up for a bigger job in the very near future. But you're right. When they've had to step up in class, they have not, looked at least as good as what they were a year ago. But obviously, they're not taking a step up in class here.
No, exactly.
And I will say this: I think Payne made a really, really good point about the strength and conditioning coach for Iowa. And as years move along, where does that show up? I think line of scrimmage. And obviously, he talked about maybe some concerns with Iowa's rush defense. Iowa's offensive line isn't as good as what it's been in recent editions. I mean, when you don't throw the football very much at all, and you're still allowing 33 sacks already on the season, that tells you there's a problem up front there. So I don't expect this matchup particularly to expose whatever deficiencies Minnesota's defense has.
And you And you mentioned it, Brad, talking about the offensive line. That was one thing that Iowa players have brought up throughout the course of this week. I mean, granted, the unit showed improvement in wins against Northwestern and Purdue, but last week against Wisconsin, I mean, you give up 6 sacks, 11 tackles for loss. We know Jim Leonard likes to get creative, but you saw a lack of communication along that offensive line. Now, maybe it's a little bit different here because Minnesota's defensive scheme, or at least their base defense, is similar to what Iowa plays, so there'll be an increased level of familiarity, but clearly something that I think you guys are spot on trying to highlight. When you lose a strength and conditioning coach, we know how many offensive linemen Iowa's put in the next level. It doesn't look to be the same road grading unit that we've seen in the past. Hopefully for Iowa, they are able to identify at least a running back that's capable, as Caleb Johnson appears to be the most dynamic back they have carrying the ball, and we did see them using a slightly more when you look at more gap blocking schemes than what they've grown accustomed to. We'll see if that pays dividends in this particular spot. Payne, wasn't sure if there was anything else you wanted to add. I feel like we spent way too much time on Iowa, Minnesota already as is.
Move us to my favorite conference in the world.
Your favorite conference in the world? Your Mountain West for a little non-Powers 5 type of dabble? I mean, I know you love the Mountain West, especially in college basketball.
Is that what's next?
That is what's next. We go rotation order. How many times have we done these podcasts?
That is true. That is true.
Man,
I'm
man.
a little off my game.
Brad, you work with a guy for, going on almost 10 years now, and you think he knew the format for how this podcast worked. But all right.
I created the format.
That's even worse than you don't know exactly how it's going to go. All right, we're going to Logan, Utah. Utah State, a short home underdog, catching 2 as they'll welcome in San Jose State. Total on the game, 51 in the Mountain West. You look at the Spartans, they have really struggled of late over their last couple of games, failing to meet odds makers' expectations in each of their last 4, and a team that looked by all intents and purposes to have an inside track to maybe win their half of the Mountain West. That couldn't be further from the truth right now. Arguably bottoming out last weekend, giving up 40-plus points against San Diego State. Brad, you've identified a side in this matchup that's caught your eye. Outline for our listeners why you think the market is incorrect on one or both of these teams.
Yeah, Utah State is the preferred side here for a multitude of reasons. But I think that the strongest is actually more anti-San Jose State based. And it's basically current form for San Jose State, which last 4 games for them has been really bad. And there's really anything that they can really hang their hat on in any of those performances. They failed to cover the number by about 15 points per game. I could say, is it turnovers? No, not necessarily. It's a offense that can't run the ball. I mean, those 4 games, 43 rushing yards per game. I mean, that's obviously, as bad as it gets in college football. That's worrisome here because if you're going to expose Utah State's defense, it's via the ground game, and if you can't do that, I'm not sure how much success you can have via the airways. Defensively has been the biggest drop off for San Jose State here in the last month. I mean, look, I could get, maybe you're getting wore down a little bit as the season progresses, but it should not excuse you giving up 468 yards to Colorado State, a bottom 10 offense. San Diego State leaves a hell of a lot to be desired offensively. They gave up over 400 yards in that game and 40 points. I'm not sure what happened. This is pure speculation on my part. They did unfortunately have, one of the players tragically, lost his life in a scooter accident around the time that this slide started happening. So I'm not sure if that impacted team chemistry, but this is I have not downgraded a team far enough in my power rankings last month than San Jose State, and I'm not even sure it's enough at this point. And certainly, and the market hasn't caught up to it. On the other side, I think this is kind of an important handicap this time of year, engaging teams that maybe it's important for them to go to a bowl, and I think it is for Utah State, especially considering where they were at the start of the season, losing to Weber State. You think the season's lost. They're playing their best football. I mean, they're 4-1 their last 5 games straight up, and the one loss, they were down to a 4-string quarterback. So I think that data point kind of gives you a little bit of value there. And finally, I'm going to mention it since, weather's been a topic that we talked about in the 2 Midwest games. It's also going to be a factor here. I mean, kickoff temps 16 degrees. And I know it's not SoCal, it's NoCal kids, but still, I'm not sure that they're used to playing in 16 degrees. So you add all that up, I think there's value here on Utah State.
You know what? And you mentioned Utah State looking to get bowl eligible. I always think it's important when you get to, games 9, 10, 11, you try and forecast out what the schedule is going to look like. And this game on paper, much more manageable for the Aggies to get that elusive 6 win than what would happen if they lose on Saturday and have to beat Boise State in the regular season finale to get where they want to go. Another thing to keep in mind for Utah State, Blake Anderson seemed to be pretty optimistic that the team could get back one of its most impactful defensive players in MJ Tafisi. Paces the team and tackles for loss. It's not an overly explosive defense in terms of creating havoc, but there is a chance that he comes back in the fold, and I think you'd want all hands on deck for just the reasons that you outlined, Brad, talking about San Jose State, how they've been unable to establish the ground game even against some of the dregs of the Mountain West and relying much more on Chevin Cordero to run around and create plays. Payne, this is your favorite conference, so I don't want to try and gloss over any analysis that you might be able to add. Is there anything else as far as perspective or where your numbers sit on the Utah State San Jose State showdown, which inevitably now will have a huge uptick in viewers with Bet the Board listeners firmly entrenched and, more importantly, invested?
I'm a big Utah State guy, as you know. Shane Rector, big fan of the former point guard at Utah State. What I will say here is, and it's not going to be specific to this game, there were some comments, mentions, direct messages, emails, and I love all of the listeners asking me to confirm Brad's bet last week. Let me kind of put this out there for you. The reason Brad is on this podcast is because we've confirmed his acumen, right? Brad is in the 0.1% of college football bettors that originate, beat a closing line, and win long term. So he does not need my confirmation or blessings on these, but I will peel back the curtain a little bit. I sent a text message to Todd last night, as I typically do on Tuesday evening, said, hey, give me your 3 or 4 best choices for a best bet. And in Todd fashion, he sends me 9 of games which no one's talked about at any point this week, one of which we knew was going to be canceled. And then I just replied with Todd ... He knew what I meant. He sent me back 3 games, one of which was Utah State. So I think this gets the blessing.
It's always funny, Brad. We do this for as long as we have. I get these stern lectures from Payne. He calls me corporate Todd. He knows kind of how to try and read the tea leaves in terms of what's going on, the kind of poking and prodding I need. Just for clarity's sake here, for our loyal listeners that are out there, if Brad, you're in the top 0.01% of college football bettors, I am not. That's the reason that I play host, and that's the value that I add to this particular podcast. So to your point, Payne, I mean, for folks that are listening to all of this, when we look to bring people into the fold and the members of the Bet the Board family, it's not because we're throwing darts at the board. They're the best at what they do. And Brad, you've definitely fallen into that bucket. So Utah State, gentlemen, clearly a game that should be on everyone's radar. Want you guys to follow Brad on Twitter at BradPower7. I'm Todd Furman. You can follow me there if you want, and I don't encourage you to. You can follow Payne as well at Payne Insider. Most importantly, though, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. And Payne, I know you were jumping the gun, so I feel like you should get to lead off on this game because this is truly your favorite conference in college football. That, of course, being the Pac-12 and a massive game.
I thought it was the Mountain West again.
No Mountain West. We're done with the Mountain West exposure for this portion of the program. We're going to the Rose Bowl, baby, where UCLA welcomes in USC, looking to play spoiler for the crosstown rivals. It's USC, a 2.5-point road favorite. Total in the game, 75 in a series that goes back to 1929. And Lincoln Riley has exceeded everyone's expectations in year one. When you look at USC, 9-1 start to the season is the best for the program since 2008. When they went 12-1 and defeated Penn State in the Rose Bowl. Title scenarios: UCLA clinches a place in the conference title game with the win, which would be their first since 2020 and the 4th in program history. UCLA, meanwhile, in the wake of their upset loss last week against Arizona, losing as nearly a 3-touchdown favorite, going to need a little bit of help to make that goal a reality. They did have their 8-game home winning streak snapped, losing to Arizona last Saturday. Brad, when you look at these two teams, we know USC was lauded as a buy low candidate, could be most improved, but still maybe not exceed odds makers' expectations with a win total at 9.5. What have you done for their power rating this season? Because as explosive as their offense has looked, and Caleb Williams very much in the thick of things for Heisman consideration, that defense for stretches looks like it performs at a group of 5 level more often than not.
So you mentioned it. It was a team that I did have coming into the season as the most improved team in the country, but yet I still found a way to bet under their season win total because they were being priced like a borderline top 5 team. With that being said, I've upgraded USC slightly. Why not? I mean, I'm going to lose that most likely that season win total bet. We'll see, though. They got 2 tough matchups here to close the season. It hasn't been a significant upgrade because of the defensive concerns, which showed at the start of the season. And then you thought they were making some improvements, and then, injuries hit them, especially in the back 7. And, the last 4 weeks, it's been pretty bad on that side of the ball. But I think, and we'll jump into it, the reason that probably isn't a +3 since the start of the season as far as 3 points better than what I expected is a key injury on the offense side of the ball, that being running back Travis Dye out for the season. Even with getting the return of Jordan Addison, Mario Williams likely at wide receiver, Dye is a pretty vital role for USC, so only a slight upgrade for them.
And we'll get to that Dye injury. I'm glad you brought it up now because I definitely think it's important. We talk about skill players and their diminished value to the point spread. On the other side for UCLA, I know it's a team that we've seen involved in battles in the betting market earlier this year. 2 games we broke down against Washington and Utah. What have you done with the Bruins given their full body of work? And how do you go about changing an overall power number this late in the year when a team like UCLA goes out there, and it wasn't a fluke that they lost to Arizona. They just weren't able to get off the field, make plays, and Arizona beat them soundly in a lot of key box score metrics.
Yeah, so UCLA is another team. Similar situation for USC. Upgrade 2.5 points since the start of the season. Wasn't as high, at least early on in those matchups. You mentioned the betting battles. I lost those battles. I was fading UCLA in those home games against Washington and Utah where they exceeded expectations. Defensively, just like USC has been a concern here the last 3-4 weeks. And, I did downgrade them last week. How couldn't you? I mean, it wasn't a situation where they were a 20-point favorite and lost the game because they were -5 in turnovers. They were legitimately beat in that game. I will say this. I'm not necessarily sure that UCLA played it's not like I gave them an F for that performance. I thought they were flat, but they played okay. I think it was more that popped off when I was watching it was the playmaking abilities and how much improved in just 1 year this Arizona program is. So I do want to put that in perspective. It wasn't a typical thing you see when you see a 20-point underdog winning outright. I thought Arizona, for a lot of the game, what was the better team and looked the better team. I'm not sure what that says about UCLA. Obviously, it doesn't say much about their chances of being a playoff contender, but I think it was more about Arizona and their improvements than UCLA being just not that good.
And that's a great point. I mean, Arizona was a team that I think a lot of people were optimistic on. They weren't sure if Jed Fish's bunch was going to be able to turn the corner yet, knowing it takes at least a couple of recruiting cycles. But clearly momentum is building. It might be a stock people are looking to buy in the Pac-12. We'll see if Arizona can finish up with a pair of wins and maybe get bowl eligible if they're able to upset Washington State and win the Territorial Cup, the final game of the season. Payne, Brad mentioned the injury to Travis Dye. And when you look at USC, they started off terribly on the offensive side against Colorado. Still were able to get outside the number with a touchdown coming with under a minute to go. They finished with a scoring average of more than 4.5 points per drive. That's their 4th best performance of the season. You look at where they were from a yards per play perspective, 7.2. They now average 7 yards per play against Pac-12 opponents. When you're trying to assess where this team is or can be offensively, game against UCLA, game against Notre Dame, and a potential Pac-12 championship, how much of a downgrade do you think they experience, or how much does it change without Travis Dye, given that he was the bell cow back? He was a leader of the offense from a veteran leadership standpoint, and you look at some of his touchdown productivity, right there in that 9 touchdown range.
Yeah, I think we're in this day and age where everyone is devaluing the running back position, and it's caught on in the betting markets, right? No one thinks running backs are worth anything. But if you speak with sophisticated USC fans and bettors, they believe Caleb Williams is 1A and Travis Dye is 1B in terms of importance to USC's offense. And if you just look at usage rates, I mean, there's only 2 USC offensive players with a usage rate above 10%. It's Caleb Williams at 61%, Travis Dye at 24%. And if you look at just standard downs, Caleb's at 54%, Dye's at 32%. So it's not just the production on the field. You could just see everyone rally around him when he did get injured. It's clear that he's the calming influence in the leader of the offense because he is that veteran presence. I think Caleb Williams is fantastic, but still a young kid. So I think Dye is absolutely worth something to the spread. Now, if you just look at the efficiency numbers, Austin Jones and Rayleigh Brown and even Darwin Barlow are plenty capable. The cupboard isn't bare. Austin Jones is a 4-star kid, and I know they made a push to get him in the transfer portal, and Stanford was really pissed about it. But, I mean, USC's offensive line is going to be what matters most here, I think. They've been getting some good push up front. They're top 20 in offensive line yards. UCLA hasn't really shown the ability to stop the run all that well. They're outside the top 100 in both defensive line yards, rushing success rate allowed, and now, they're also outside the top 100 in EPA per rush allowed. So it would have been nice to have Dye, but I don't know if USC's run game just completely falls off a cliff when you look at both the matchup and who they have there. Brad mentioned some of the injuries to USC's receivers. I mean, Jordan Addison and Mario Williams have been banged up on the outside. They were, on pitch counts last week, and I think Mario Williams is probably the one that's the larger question mark there. UCLA, though, when I look at their pass defense, they're going to at least make USC work the ball downfield a little bit, force Caleb Williams to be perfect. UCLA, if you watch them, they're willing to let you pick up 5, 6, 7, 8 yards a pass, and they want to see if you can just be methodical, because you look at the metrics, right? Outside the top 90 in passing success rate allowed, but UCLA kind of refuses to give up the explosive. They're top 15 in explosive pass defense. So let's see if Caleb Williams is willing to stay patient and make these drives go 10, 12 plays. Very similar to last week's Washington-Oregon game. Right, you're basing this matchup on who can get the timely stop or the turnover, come up with that creative little adjustment that might shock the system for a possession or two, and sometimes stealing that possession or two is all you need in a game like this. I hate breaking these down, right? These are my least favorite games to deep dive and talk about because everything slants so hard in favor of the offenses. But you look at USC, they've had a couple bumps in the road throughout the season, right? Oregon State really bottled up the Trojans. The offense wasn't dominant enough to outscore a Utah team that we have some question marks about their playmakers on the outside. There's been some talks this week, and I know, Todd, you and I have texted about it, but we've read the same articles about USC holding things back.
Yep.
Maybe so, right? Maybe we see some different looks out of USC, but I saw that and just immediately shook my head for two reasons, right? If you're truly holding things back and haven't put something on film, are you divulging that to the world 5 days before the game, or are you just going to shock somebody with it, right? The second thing you seriously have to ask, if that's the case, you decided not to put this elite stuff to use when you needed one more score against Utah, or you were in one-score games against Arizona and Cal to eke out wins, or Lincoln Riley's holding back all this gold when they were held scoreless for the first 20 minutes against Colorado, right? It doesn't pass the sniff test to me. If USC wins this game, it's because Caleb Williams plays like a Heisman. Lincoln Riley is in the zone with his play calling, and we've seen sometimes when he's in the zone, right, it's tough to knock him out of it. They're going to win this game because Austin Jones allows USC's ground game to not skip a beat, and Addison and Mario are 100% healthy and just dominating. It's not because Lincoln Riley's holding back like the annexation of Puerto Rico for 10 games and he's just going to unleash it here, right? I didn't buy anything that I read from that. So obviously USC's got a large matchup advantage here. We'll see if Caleb Williams is willing to be patient and work the ball 8, 10, 12 plays without being turnover prone, or maybe it is a massive drop off and they aren't able to survive without Travis Dye, but they do have some advantages here, obviously.
When you mention USC, just to kind of put some of their offensive proficiency into historical context, they've scored 424 points already this season. That's the most by USC through 10 games in school history. They've scored 40-plus points in 8 games this season, tied for the most in school history with a team back in 2003. They've scored 40-plus points in 4 consecutive games in a single season for the first time since 2003. And even more impressively, maybe than some of those numbers, they've now scored touchdowns on 20 of their last 22 trips inside the opponent's red zone. Brad, this was one of the largest totals that we saw, at least on the opener, at 82.5. Do you think that was a little bit too aggressive? Obviously, we've seen the market respond, and it settled into the mid-70s. Were you behind part of that move initially?
I was, and it wasn't necessarily it's obviously it's always numbers. I thought it was a little high, a little shocking. What was by far the highest total that we've seen so far in college football, and those two high totals last week didn't get there. And if you look at least the last couple of seasons, a lot of these high totals have not been getting there as far as going over, where typically for a long period there, 5+ years ago, all these totals couldn't get high enough in college football. That's not been the case here recently. I think a little bit under the radar, and I think it's going to require a little bit more investigation later in the week. If you watched that Arizona UCLA game last week, the field conditions at the Rose Bowl were abysmal. I mean, I've seen 100+ games in 30 years at the Rose Bowl. I have never seen the field look like that. I mean, players could not get footing, slipping and sliding. And if we have similar field conditions, I can tell you this, I don't want to have an over 75+ ticket in my pocket in this particular game, regardless of how much advantages the offenses have over the opposing defenses.
I figured for this kind of spot, Brad, you'd have picked up the phone, you'd have called your contacts in South Bend and the grounds crew there. They could have phoned in the best approach for UCLA to slow down this Trojan offense, much like we saw with Matt Leinart and Reggie Bush back in the day, where I'm convinced that grass came up to the players' knees to try and slow down some of the athletes on the outside. But, for all our talk, guys, about how great USC has been offensively and some of the matchup advantages they'll have against the Bruins defense, the same can be said on the other side of the ball, where you look at UCLA offensively, and they had scored 30 or more points in 12 straight games before their loss to Arizona. The UCLA offense currently ranked number 4 in the country, averaging a shade less than 4 points per drive. And DTR, we know he's been on campus in Westwood for a long time. He didn't shy away from embracing some of the chatter in the wake of that Arizona loss, saying that UCLA is going to do to USC again this weekend what they did last year to the Trojans when they hung north of 60 on them. Payne, when you look at UCLA's offense against this USC's defense, where do the path to success exist for the baby blue and gold?
Yeah, probably everywhere. I mean, we talked a little bit in prior breakdowns about USC's defense having turnover luck early in the season and how that was kind of enabling the scoreboard to paint a picture that wasn't really an accurate depiction of the Trojan stop unit here. But then there was this little 3-game stretch from Oregon State to Washington State where you could see some incremental improvement down to down for USC's defense, and obviously, some injuries played a part in those games. But all hell's broken loose again recently. I mean, Utah hung 43. Arizona exceeded their point expectation. Cal, a fringe top 100 offense, had its most impressive outburst of the season against this USC defense. And to your point about DTR's quote, I hated that. I mean, just keep your mouth shut. He wasn't the only one either. You have defensive backs. You just lost as a 3-touchdown favorite. I get it. You're supposed to be confident, but shut your mouth. Don't give them bulletin board material. I completely agree, right? Talking about hanging 60 again and creating that bulletin board material, especially after you're largely responsible for pissing away the season, just days ago to Arizona. Call me old school, but I didn't like seeing that. Now, UCLA obviously wants to pound you in the trenches. USC cannot stop the run. I mean, you look at this matchup. I mean, UCLA, top 20 in offensive line yards. They're top 10 in schedule adjusted rushing success rate, yards per rush, explosive runs, and EPA per rush. I mean, make no bones about this. UCLA is physically dominant running the ball. And USC really hasn't shown the ability to want to kind of tangle in that area or get in those kinds of fistfights. And you just kind of watch some of their games, and they still look a little undersized in the front seven. And, when you adjust for a very weak schedule, USC is outside the top 125 in rushing success rate allowed, explosive runs, EPA per rush. All of this lends itself to the largest mismatch of the entire weekend in any game on paper. This specific one, right? UCLA's run game versus USC's run defense. You look again, Utah, Arizona, Cal, right? It made the Trojans defense look like what we thought it was to begin the year. And there was an interesting quote that was heading into the Colorado game last week, and it was kind of wild. And I think people know my affinity for Alex Grinch, although it hasn't been the greatest the last few seasons. But he said going into last week's game, we're 10 weeks into the season, which As soon as I say that, I want to vomit. Some of the issues, I don't know if these are things we can fix. We've had 11 months to do a lot of things around here, but we've yet to get it right. So, listen, it's year one. There's holes on this USC defense. It wasn't going to be fixed in one offseason through the portal, and it's a team that lacks depth, and we talked about that a little bit, and this is a sport of attrition, and here we are in week 12. And I think we have to monitor the Shane Lee and Eric Gentry situations for this game. Those two linebackers being 100% healthy and playing are the only chance I think USC has maybe like providing a speed bump and slowing down Charbonnet and DTR on the ground. So those are things to look for here. But the largest mismatch in this entire game is UCLA on the ground pummeling USC in the trenches here.
I mean, honestly, this should be like old school Tecmo Bowl. When UCLA is calling plays offensively, you have 3 running plays designed for Zach Charbonnet, up the middle, run right, run left, and then a play-action pass for DTR to try and get his receivers involved. We'll see Casimir Allen. That's the one injury you're going to want to keep tabs on for the UCLA offense. There appeared to be optimism that he would be out there. He's a little bit more of an underneath threat, but a perfect complement to Jake Bobo. The last question I have on this game will go to you, Brad. When you look at UCLA, we've seen the pathetic crowds that they typically put forth at the Rose Bowl. We know this game has increased magnitude. 2 fan bases that don't like each other very much given the proximity and everything else, which is unique even by rivalry standards. Do you do anything for home field advantage in this spot with the increased level of familiarity, or do you just look at these two teams based on how they're power rated?
Excellent question. A little bit of home field to UCLA just because used to playing in the arena. So I'm in between a half point and a point of home field advantage. Crowd, I expect to be 50-50. Maybe even a little bit more USC fans if they're excited. Who knows with the California fans. I do want to mention one thing. You brought up the Shane Lee and Eric Gentry injuries. I think they're critical, but I still, if we're going to bring up 1994 Little Giants references, neither one of them, to me, are capable of being an icebox in this matchup.
Hey, I'm convinced if you go back and watch that Little Giants footage, though, Icebox would have been ejected from a couple of those games for targeting. But, hey, look, we know rules change. Things are a little bit different.
Especially if they were the refs in the Wake Forest game.
There's no doubt. She would have never even started the game if that was the case, given some of the officiating we saw there. But no doubt the marquee game of the weekend, USC appears to be very much in control of their own playoff destiny. That resume will look significantly better if you're able to beat UCLA, follow it up with a showdown against Notre Dame in your regular season finale and a Pac-12 championship opponent, whether it appears to be Utah, Oregon, or if things break the right way, Washington, with an improbable path to try and get there. Speaking of Utah and Oregon, this game loses a little bit of luster, but I still think it should be a phenomenal watch from Outson Stadium. Saturday night, Pac-12 after dark. Oregon, a 3-point favorite, and that's painted pretty much across the board in this game. The total, interestingly enough, as low as 61.5 in some spots, upwards of 63. The winner controls its own destiny to the Pac-12 title game. Utah, Oregon, and the aforementioned USC all tied atop the league with 1 loss. Utah hasn't won in Eugene since 2015. I know they haven't played there every year, so it comes with an asterisk. But Utah did sweep the season series last year, winning in Salt Lake City and then blowing out the Ducks in Vegas for the conference title game. In those matchups, Utah scored 38 points in both games and averaged nearly 200 yards rushing. Meanwhile, Oregon struggled to score, struggled to establish the ground game, and the average margin wasn't close. But at the same time, you look at Utah lately, Brad, and they just haven't been very good when they go out on the road in terms of covering numbers, just 3-7 against the spread. When you look at some of those things, if it happens a couple of times, you go, okay, it's an anomaly more than anything else. But clearly something isn't clicking for this Utes team, either on the offensive or defensive line, that they're underwhelming at the betting window when they leave the confines of Rice-Eccles Stadium.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head. It is at the line of scrimmage where they've kind of coming up short in those big games this year. And I look at the three games that were perceived, at least until this game, were perceived to be the biggest games of the season. Florida, UCLA, USC. I thought they came up more short on the defensive side of the ball. Allowed Florida to have a lot of rush success, got controlled at the line of scrimmage in that game. UCLA had their way, and then some 500-plus yards. And I know they ended up getting a win against USC, but it wasn't necessarily because of the defense. I mean, SC was pretty much able to do what they wanted to do offensively, sans a couple of series. That's you can. I'll excuse some of the Utah's inefficiencies on offense, injuries and whatnot. But defensively, to me, is where they've really come up short as far as I'm concerned.
Hey, I mean, it's one of the things that we've grown accustomed to Utah being much more defensive-minded and having shortcomings offensively. That's been a little bit of a role reversal. To Utah's credit, though, they are still one of 6 Power 5 programs that rank in the top 25 nationally in scoring offense and scoring defense this year. I was a little bit stunned by that because, Brad, much like you highlighted there, you watch Utah and they don't overwhelm you with anything they do defensively. So, Payne, I'll flip the question to you then. You look at Utah last week, 42-7 against Stanford. The score is what it is, but maybe most importantly, Tavion Thomas looked like himself. Rushed for a career-high 180 yards, and you're talking about a player that has dealt with a laundry list of off-field situations where he left the team for a little while. He's seen his workload diminish. I think when you're talking about winning marquee games on the road late in the year, you want to have your bell cow back. But it isn't more about Bo Nix and his health in the Oregon offense attacking Utah's defense that's been vulnerable, or seeing what Cam Rising can do on the road leading this Utah attack against an Oregon defense that had absolutely no answers in crunch time for Michael Penix and what the Huskies wanted to do with an aerial assault.
Bo Nix's health is obviously the biggest factor to the point spread in this game, and we saw him itching to get back in the game on that 4th and 1, and he did some wild jump in the air to kind of signal he was okay. So let's see how that ultimately unfolds. But to your guys' point, Utah has been a little off this year, right? They just haven't played to the standard that we've seen in recent years, and they've been pushed around in the trenches when stepping up in class. And even with like this elite NFL corner type and Clark Phillips, Utah's outside the top 100 in EPA per pass allowed, partly because of that deficiency along the defensive line. We've seen Morgan Scalley basically play with heavier boxes. One thing we know is Oregon is dependent on its offense. We're not quite sure what's going on with Bo Nix, although the line indicates that he is in, but they can't win without their offense. We know that. So to me, the more intriguing matchup is the largest factor is Utah's offense against Oregon's defense, specifically the pass attack. You know, we talked about the Ducks' inability to stop the pass last week, and ultimately that ended up being the largest factor, and Penix and Washington just picked the Ducks' secondary apart, and I think the Penix performance was even more impressive based upon what Kalen DeBoer was asking him to do, right? It wasn't just distribute the ball and be efficient, but basically we want you to be out of rhythm and be efficient, because they were winding the clock down, and sometimes that's tough. You lose your form, you lose your rhythm when you're just kind of sitting there waiting for the shot clock to expire, so to speak. But that was something to me that I just, you know, we knew it was a deficiency in the box scores and the metrics, and it just was prevalent there. Now, Utah's offense is much different, right? Heavier formations. They like the advantage in the box count with Cam Rising on designed runs, and Utah's going to find success running here, right? And they'll probably hit some explosive runs. Utah top 20 in EPA per rush still, despite the offensive line not being, you know, great. Oregon's defense, yes, the best part of it is the front seven, but they're still outside the top 100 in EPA per rush allowed. But I really think we might see Utah just a little bit try to open things up a touch. And when you look at both standard down run rates and run rates over expectation, right, Utah does lean into that. But I think for Utah to kind of pull this upset off, does Utah have the weapons to really consistently attack Oregon's secondary? And ultimately, that's going to be the deciding factor of this game. We've seen Devon Vele kind of come on a bit recently. He's talked about how he's 24 years old, and even though he's only a redshirt sophomore, that he's going to go to the NFL draft. And so, you know, it's kind of a big stretch for him down the season. We know what Dalton Kincaid can do. He can line up anywhere, right? Slot, in line, out wide, doesn't matter. So Utah will want to run it, and they're going to have some success there. But I think the Utes have to be able to just attack the Ducks secondary when they decide to throw it. And you look at Oregon, right? I mean, they're just barely inside the top 120 in schedule adjusted EPA per pass allowed. Dan Lanning does not trust the secondary. That's very, very clear, because they just provide large cushions and coverage. It's why over 49% of passes have graded successful against the Ducks. That's a rate outside the top 100. So there's a lot of factors here, obviously, right? As I said, Bo Nix's health being probably the largest one. But on this side of the ball, Utah has to be able to take advantage of the biggest weakness, in my mind, to pull off the upset. And, my understanding here is we might see a little bit of a battle on this game, even if Bo Nix does get upgraded and does play in this. It'll be interesting to see at what point that buy might come in on Utah. There's, starting to kind of leak towards 3.5. Again, the line insinuates Bo Nix plays, but we know the market and the screen does some weird things. And sometimes when you get that notification that he's upgraded and it hits the Don Best screen, that ultimately moves the market a little bit. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there ultimately when limits rise, and this could potentially leak up a little bit with that notification of Bo Nix being in. Do we finally see a little Utah money?
Interesting note here, talking about Bo Nix's health. There are some key contributors along that Oregon offensive line that are a little bit nicked up as well, so you're going to want to monitor the health and status of those two individuals. Oregon apparently has closed practices this week for media availability, so you always wonder what kind of chicanery is going on behind the scenes when those kind of things are there, but something to try and monitor as we all anticipate that Bo Nix will be out there available and healthy, but if he's not, we'll see the market take off, especially knowing this will be the most heavily bet game in the final time slot of the day. No offense, UNLV and Hawaii, you folks aren't moving the needle at the betting window. All right.
It's been whisper quiet from that that region.
When you're looking at the college football landscape, obviously there's one conference we haven't paid any attention to, and it's not Payne's beloved ACC, where there isn't a matchup worth discussing in great detail this weekend. It's, of course, the Big 12, one of which is a rivalry game where it's more bragging rights on the line, but one game that we'll see kicking off at 11 o'clock Central on Saturday has major national championship implications, and that is TCU's trip across the state to take on Baylor in lovely Waco, where you've seen TCU bet down from a full field goal favorite into that 2.5 range. Total in this game hasn't moved much, 57.5, 58 more or less the prevailing numbers there. A year ago, it was TCU on the other end of the spectrum, upsetting a top 5 Baylor team. Who knows if revenge will be in the cards. TCU in an unenviable spot of playing their 9th straight week. Sonny Dykes wasn't shy about mentioning that in his press conference on Monday. And when you look at Baylor, they have been a Big 12, killer in the past, trying to go through and what happened in 2012 and in 2015. They knocked off Kansas State and Oklahoma State. But Brad, when you look at performances late in the year, you can always explain why certain teams may be overwhelmed or underwhelmed at the betting window, but there may not have been a result on Saturday that was more inexplicable than Baylor, with everything to play for at home against Kansas State, going out there and laying an egg. Now, losing and failing to cover is one thing, but being blown out of your own building to the tune of 31-3 when you close as a 2.5-point favorite, a little bit eye-opening. What does it say about the Bears, or what does it say about the way the market has set a price on this showdown between two Texas programs on Saturday?
Well, first off, very uncharacteristic of Baylor, at least the last year plus under Dave Aranda. Obviously, they ended up winning the Big 12 last year, and even though they've lost a few games here and there, this year, you can kind of explain away some of them. I won't bring up the BYU game. Oklahoma State game, there were some non-offensive touchdowns, but Baylor had the yardage edge in that one. West Virginia, there was a quarterback injury for Baylor. If Chapin doesn't get hurt, I think they win that game. You're right. That would, to me, of all the results, all the upsets that we saw, was the biggest head scratcher, because I did not anticipate that result. I mean, not surprised that Kansas State won, but was surprised that Baylor's offense, 3 points. Some of it's probably the inconsistency of Blake Shapen, the quarterback. I mean, he's only number 61 in QBR, 8 interceptions, only 13 passing touchdowns this year. I mean, that's when they named him the starter out of the spring, it was almost like a rubber stamp slam dunk. He's our guy not only for this year, but he's our guy for the next several years. I got to tell you, I mean, I'm not overly confident that he is the answer to get this program back to where they were just a year ago. So I think some of the offensive efficiencies, start with the quarterback last week.
Yeah, I mean, Kansas State, again, didn't have their starting quarterback for the entire game. Adrian Martinez starts 7 of 8 for 25 yards. And then Will Howard steps in and, like a knight in shining armor, carries Kansas State to where they needed to go. But you look at Baylor, opening drive, they march down the field. Blake Shapen gets intercepted, and you hate to say that one bad throw really rattled his confidence, but it appeared to be that case. When you look at Baylor, 10-6 against the spread at home under Dave Aranda, 9-3 ATS at home since 2021 in Aranda's second season. season. Baylor 11-4 against the spread as an underdog the last 15 times they've been catching points. And in a small sample size anomaly in 7 Baylor league games this year, the favored team is now 1-6 straight up. Payne, when you try and look at the numbers, and we've talked about TCU and how enigmatic they've been, typically when you're a top 4 team, odds makers are going to force you to pay a premium if you want to back them. Last week, we were on the wrong side, and I don't shy away from it. We laid the points with Texas, knew our bacon was potentially cooked, when we went into halftime down 3-0 and Texas couldn't do anything offensively. But has the market caught up enough to TCU yet, or is there still potential value in looking to try and bet against the Horned Frogs in a spot like this where you see Baylor installed as a short underdog?
I mean, it's like Walmart falling prices still. Sonny Dykes deserves all the credit in the world, and he seems to be a perfect program fit for TCU, and fit is important. And I think we all believe Dykes is a good coach, but he was 19-30 at Cal, and this is year 1, and being 10-0 and entrenched in the college football playoff is kind of nuts. Now, we've talked about TCU multiple times over the last few weeks, so it has this repetitive nature, and I'm sure some casual football fans that tune in because they like to hear what's going on think we're probably crazy and need to come around on TCU at this point. Listen, I look at this, and looking at our numbers, if a good college football team played TCU's exact schedule, they'd be expected to have 6.8 wins. TCU has 10. It's the largest gap in all of college football, and I know what that's supposed to depict. But for me, having watched TCU and seen how these games have unfolded and comparing it to the metrics, it shows some real breaks caught along the way. I think that's probably the nicest way to put it. And we joked about this off air that, last week against Texas, give TCU all the credit in the world. Their defense showed up. They stopped the run. But if you ask anybody, hey, TCU, a team that's led by its offense, is going to have 3 points 40 minutes into the game against Texas, how much of your bankroll would you want on the Longhorns at that point? We're all emptying our accounts. And so, yes, they dominated that game. It didn't feel like Texas had a chance, but it was just won in a manner that was not very predictable, right? If you just told me, hey, TCU's offense is humming, the secondary for Texas fell apart, Quinn Ewers didn't look the part, had a couple costly turnovers, that's how they win, perfect. Holding Sark's offense to 0 points is nothing no one on planet Earth saw coming, even the biggest TCU homers. So it's just wild to see how every game it's something. We saw Sark just kind of clam up in the biggest game of his tenure. That, to me, was the get over the hump game with as much positive momentum as they had on the trail and how many recruits were in person, and Ewers was just horrific. And so I say that to say this, it's not just us. Look at what the market is telling you TCU truly is. I mean, the Frogs are favored by 2.8 points on the road against Baylor, who just lost at home to Kansas State by 4 touchdowns. And Baylor is taking pro money. And so, I mean, it's just so wild to see this unfold. But, not only do you have, differing situations in that, TCU also has all the pressure in the world on them. And now Baylor can play fast and free now that their Big 12 title hopes are all but dashed, and the players and coaches have said as much this week. And we saw Aranda come out and basically apologize to the fan base for showing up in that manner for a blackout game. And I guess the program put a ton of money into marketing that game and getting kids there, and just, completely snafu'd. But here's some of the matchups kind of getting into this. I do think Baylor, shockingly, has a little bit of an advantage if you can kind of just erase what you saw last week in a one-game sample size. Baylor's offensive line has done a good job getting some push on the ground. TCU's defense, even with last week's performance against Texas, still outside the top 80 in defensive line yards. TCU's allowed more than 14% of runs against them to gain 12 or more yards. That's outside the top 100. Baylor is top 25 in schedule-adjusted rushing success rate. So that's where their edge lies here. And then defensively, Dave Aranda has had good success over the years slowing down some air raid attacks. Now, TCU is a little bit different, right? You have Garrett Riley. He runs more than what you're used to seeing from an air raid with Miller and Duggan. But TCU likes to play a bunch of 10 personnel, so 4 wide receiver sets. They're in that formation nearly 45% of the time. Baylor had showed good success against Texas Tech's air raid about a month ago. And the other thing here is, it might be a positive. Baylor doesn't get pressure overly well, but the ball comes out fast for TCU. So that might not be a bad thing. Baylor does one thing really well through the air. They limit the explosiveness, and they're top 15 in yards allowed per rush as well. So Baylor kind of makes you work it through the air. They do a decent job stopping it on the ground. They're willing to give up some of the short stuff. So it's really an interesting matchup here. You could kind of see the path where Baylor's able to run the ball a little bit. Blake Shapen, who's looked like a deer in the headlights in some of the biggest moments this season, doesn't have much pressure on him at this point. And, we all thought it would be Texas that kind of puts an end to TCU's run, but it might be the unsuspecting Baylor team here. And again, you mentioned this perfectly, Todd, at the top. It's like, you have Sonny Dykes kind of complaining about, playing this many games in a row, and we didn't think this was a team that had a ton of depth. And so, it wouldn't be overly shocking to see this be the spot where TCU gets upset, where we are all kind of gravitating towards Texas the week prior to kind of put a snafu on TCU season.
So a couple of things, too, that I want to add. You mentioned TCU and how books have kind of viewed them throughout the course of the season. Last weekend, when TCU closed as more than a touchdown underdog on the road at Texas, they became the first AP top 5 team to be an underdog of more than 7 points versus a team outside of the AP top 10 since the FBS and FCS split back in 1978. So that kind of puts things in perspective in terms of how they've been graded. And I'll go one step further. When you look at TCU defensively, there's no doubt that was their Mona Lisa. They played with their hair on fire against Texas and deserve all the accolades in the world for what they were able to do to stymie Bijan Robinson, holding him to a season low, making Quinn Ewers look like he would be better suited to be a Texas State quarterback than a starter for the Longhorns. You look at TCU, and they've played some other early kickoffs on the road this season. Gave up 31 points at West Virginia, needed a late garbage time touchdown to get outside the number there. Gave up 31 points at Kansas. That game fell right around the number, 38-31, so odds makers were in tune there. And then they gave up 34 points earlier in the year in the old frying pan game against SMU. So we've seen vulnerability. Sonny did come out and say that he thinks his defense has made major strides over the last 2 weeks, but this is a game where they have a giant target on their back, a hell of a lot different role than what they were in last week when they could take the us against the world mentality. So no doubt books are going to see one-way traffic here, but it's almost buyer beware. I know it's tough to try and step in front of TCU if you've done it over the last couple weeks, but there's no doubt when you look at the market here, it's probably Baylor or pass. Into the final game in the Big 12, guys. And obviously, if this wasn't a major rivalry and potentially the last installment in a rivalry in Bedlam, we wouldn't be talking about it given how these teams have struggled this season, specifically Oklahoma. It's the Oklahoma Sooners, a 7.5-point favorite as they'll welcome in Oklahoma State. Total in the game, 64.5. When you look at Oklahoma, they have the second worst cover margin in the country this season at a -81. Oklahoma State, they've been very good in the underdog role, specifically on the road, 7-2 against the spread in the past 9 road games versus Big 12 teams. That does go to 2-2 this season, though, and they haven't covered in the last 2 without Spencer Sanders. When you look at Oklahoma State, more Oklahoma kids on the Cowboys roster than on the Sooners roster. But Brad, if I'd have told you before this season Oklahoma had played 10 games, they still weren't bowl eligible, what kind of odds would you have given me in the fictitious betting market?
Considering that I thought I was getting a steal with Oklahoma over 8.5 wins, I would have at least 50-1, if not higher. It's been a significant downgrade, to say the least, for Oklahoma since the start of the season. And I'll say this. Last week, of all the bad looks that they've had and getting blown out by TCU and the 49-0 debacle against Texas, I thought last week was about as bad as it gets, considering who their competition was, considering what happened in the game, +2 in turnovers. They get a 3 points off a blocked extra point returned, and you still lose outright as a touchdown plus favorite. And at least one thing, while a lot of other first-year coaches are having a lot of success, Sonny Dykes being one of them that we just talked about, and some other, even the Marcus Freemans and the Billy Napiers of the world, their teams are getting better. Not seeing that here with Oklahoma. So, I'm really stunned, especially that the defensive side of the ball has struggled as much as it has this year.
Fascinating storyline. You wonder how long a leash Brent Venables has. And I'm not advocating for them parting ways and only a 10-game sample size, but you do wonder if they'd pick up the phone in Norman and go, you know what, Coach Stoops, do you want to leave Lexington and be your brother's heir apparent to try and restore OU's legacy as we make the transition into the SEC? You mentioned downgrading Oklahoma, and rightfully so. Dillon Gabriel, I thought, was going to be a slam dunk leading this offense. It hasn't exactly looked that way by any stretch of the imagination. But Payne, in comes an Oklahoma State team that's been extremely banged up. You dig into the advanced box score last week against Iowa State. I think that had more to do with Cyclones' ineptitude than anything that the Cowboys had done to set themselves up for success. In a unique tale that I haven't quite been able to figure out, you know, Gunnar Gundy starts the game, but Spencer Sanders is healthy enough to come in and bail them out. Sanders has said there's no way he's not starting this week, and Mike Gundy hasn't said anything to the contrary. But you look at Oklahoma State offensively, they don't have big play wide receivers on the outside. Dominic Richardson has been bottled up for stretches, and the ground game has been a little bit of an afterthought. We talk all the time about reading the market and what numbers tell you. This one may be the biggest indictment of where Oklahoma State is in their current construct.
Yeah, I mean, listen, we hit this at the top that you know, we love college football traditions, and rivalry games are part of those traditions. And so we're talking about two teams with 8 losses combined, and it probably should be more. But this is Bedlam, huge rivalry game, wildly exciting finishes over the years. And I think what's going to be interesting about this breakdown is, to your point, Todd, on the surface, the number seems high, and it's an easy argument that Gundy has the coaching advantage. And Spencer Saunders, to your point, has openly said he ain't missing this game. He's playing. And it also sounds like maybe one or two other pieces could be back for Oklahoma State as well, because they've had some injuries, not just to their starting quarterback. But we've seen nothing but early sharp Oklahoma support, taking this game from below the key of 7 out to 7.5, and they're just dangling the carrot. Now let's see if that moves, you know, some thought processes here, and the hooks lead to buyback. And, you know, that early move isn't based on, you know, teams and traditions of this series. And if you strip all of that away, which is tough to do, right, it's because Oklahoma State's only outgained 3 of their 10 opponents this season. It's because Oklahoma has played the far tougher schedule. And there's some level of skepticism as to how healthy Spencer Sanders actually is. And to me, the biggest matchup advantage in this game actually favors the Sooners. The one area where there's just this massive discrepancy on paper is Oklahoma's advantage in the run game. Sooners are top 15 in schedule-adjusted rushing success rate, yards per rush, and explosive runs. The Pokes defense has not been able to really stop the run. They're outside the top 95 in both schedule-adjusted yards per rush allowed and explosive runs. And, you know, because Oklahoma has 5 losses, Eric Gray is well under the radar on the national level, despite having, you know, 1,100 yards rushing. But if you look at Gray's value, he's actually second among all non-quarterbacks in wins above average in all of college football. And then you kind of look at this when Oklahoma does drop back to pass. Dillon Gabriel does a really good job getting the ball out quick. Only been pressured on 19% of his dropbacks, and because of that, he doesn't get pressured all that often, right? But when you look at when he does get pressured, he's a shell of himself. Passer rating dips 66 points, adjusted accuracy falls off a cliff by 25%. But Oklahoma State doesn't get pressure, especially in known passing situations. The Pokes defense outside the top 100 in passing down sack rate and sacks. And that lack of pressure has led to a secondary that lost a bunch of parts in the offseason to really be shredded in these known passing situations. Oklahoma State's outside the top 100 in passing down success rate allowed. So the matchups, the metrics, the injuries, and reading what the market is saying, to your point, Todd, all kind of indicate Oklahoma here. But my feeling is, like, numbers guys are not going to agree, and so it could make this interesting to see a little battle play out here in the market.
You mentioned Eric Gray and how prolific he's been leading the Sooners charge on the ground. 25 carries for 211 yards last week. It was the 4th straight game for 100-plus yards, becoming the first Oklahoma running back to do so since Rodney Anderson in 2017. And also, if you want to have elite company as an OU running back, how about joining Adrian Peterson as the fastest to 1,100 yards since Peterson did it back in 2004? So there's no doubt a path to success for him against a much maligned Oklahoma State defense. defense that for large stretches last week in their win against Iowa State benefited immensely because the Cyclones couldn't run the football against an 8-man defense somewhere in Idaho, given what we've seen from Matt Campbell's bunch so far this season. You can follow Brad Powers on Twitter at BradPowers7. You can follow Payne there as well at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Furman. Follow me on social media on top of that. But most importantly, as always, follow the Bet the Board podcast at Bet the Board Pod. Gentlemen, we've made chicken salad out of chicken shit for a slate that looked to be a lot more attractive at this time last week if we had a couple of marquee showdowns in the Pac-12, but still plenty of games to sink our teeth into. Brad, anything in the college football landscape we failed to cover that you think is worth passing along to our loyal listenership?
Well, what we failed to cover was me. This is a little bit pulled behind the curtain. Me standing up Todd Furman last week at a UNLV game. Just you talk about not getting in the window. Just couldn't get it inside the stadium there. There was parking lot concerns, to say the least. I tried. It wasn't that, I just said forget it and stayed at home. Let's say 0 for 4 and getting a parking spot led to me turning.
Wait a second.
Whoa. Fill us
parking
in
lot.
here.
You're gonna have to further elaborate on parking lot concerns. That's awfully ambiguous because we know what goes on in some of the Las Vegas parking lots out here, and I don't want to make any insinuation, Brad, but. Maybe we were
losing. We lost Texas, and we're losing Wake. I hope he wasn't doing things in the parking lot. What's going on here, Brad?
Sorry, I wish I had better gossip. No, it was strictly. So I have season tickets to UNLV. I don't know if that's a good thing to say or not, but I do. Allegiant Stadium's great. Parking's been actually great. I found a spot last year that there's a parking lot. It's great. I just pull up. It's right across the stadium. It's easy in, easy out. I literally can be in my seat leave my place and be in my seat within 30 minutes, counting, parking, walking in the stadium, going through, the security and everything, 30 minutes. This parking lot has gotten a lot more noticeable that people are starting to figure it out like I did last year. So I pull up to that parking spot for the first time in 2 years. It's full. And I'm already running late because of some media, the considerations that I had to do. Plus I had to fill out some contests, but that's neither here nor there. So I go to another lot. It's open. There's plenty of spaces. It is prepaid only, they tell me. I'm like, there's literally spaces all over. I can't literally pay right now and get a spot. They said no. So I'm on to lot number 3. I see a couple of spots. It's pretty full, but I do see a couple spots. I pull in there, and they said they're sold out. I'm like, there's literally space right there. I'm looking at one. They said no, not sold out. So I'm like, I do kind of want to say hello to Todd. Usually I would be 3 strikes and out at that point. So I drive about a half mile or so down the road. It's a little shady there. There's not much lighting. It's away from the stadium. It's $20. I'm like, okay, that's fine. I got to walk, but so be it. Now, pull behind the curtain. If you've been to Allegiant Stadium is cashless. In a town where cash has been king for 50-plus years, Allegiant Stadium does not accept cash as payment. It's totally cashless.
Fact.
And I learned the hard way last year at that. Well, I usually have cash on me. Just so happens, since Allegiant is cashless, I don't need to bring that with me. Well, I should have, because this particular parking lot was cash only, would not take card. 0 for 4. We're already talking about the end of the first quarter. I drive home and say, sorry, Todd, couldn't make it tonight.
I understand where I am in the pecking order, but Payne, I'm a little bit disappointed in some of this that, from the Payne Life Skills 101 class that I've been an ongoing student in, that you wouldn't have told Brad he's got to get a parking lot attendance for that first lot, make sure he can shoot them a note ahead of time. Hey, look, I'm going to be a little bit late for the game. Make sure you save the spot for Nick Papagiorgio that I'm always in when I show up to UNLV home games, instead of having to go through this mad dash. For me, and I haven't been to nearly as many games at Allegiant, Brad, it's all about Mandalay Bay, parking there and walking across the bridge. It's the only thing I found to be easy in, easy out, relatively speaking, but it can be a little bit of a long walk. And since I've grown soft over the years, it was cold as shit.
It was cold. That was also under
when it was about 38 to 40 degrees.
Yeah. It was super cold. So I hear you. That was going to be option 5, but let's just say the blood pressure was up at that point where it was going to be negative EV to walk. Maybe I needed to walk to walk that long ways in the cold weather to cool off, but it had exceeded a boiling point at that point.
It happens. You'll get excused. You'll move much further down on the Golden Knights season ticket holder pecking order. Once football season's over and you're looking for something to do on a Wednesday night, you'll just have to be my fourth or fifth call, Brad. Well down on the list from where you would have been in the normal pecking order. But I appreciate the effort.
I'm used to being fourth or fifth choice when it comes to that kind of stuff.
I did, in fact, go to the UNLV game. I texted Payne that my goal was to leave midway through the third quarter. Unfortunately, there was plenty of point spread drama from start to finish. I did not have a ticket on either side, but felt obligated to stick it out, watch the end, and try and figure out why Marcus Arroyo takes it down to 9 seconds before kicking the field goal rather than doing that with a minute 10 to go. But that's neither here nor there. So either way, every now and again, a look behind the curtain of what life is like as a professional sports bettor. That may be as exciting as it gets for the three of us during the course of football season. Brad, best of luck, my friend, with all your bevy of investments this week on the college football gridiron. We'll look forward to chatting with you. Same time, same place next week.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Amazing, Payne. Amazing. For all my time of online internet dating, the things that I had to endure, the excuses, the laundry list, the no-shows, never once was I stood up for a mandate by someone who said they couldn't find a parking spot outside of an 80,000-seat stadium in Las Vegas. Brad is definitely moving down my power ratings of favored humans.
It sounds like your typical dating history with the opposite sex. I'm sure you've gotten that excuse.
Oh, legit blown off. Right? I can handle legit blow off. Like, don't make excuses. You don't have to, blow smoke up my ass. Just tell me you didn't want to be there. I'm a grown man. I can handle it with the best of them.
No, Brad's intent on bad football. And so I don't think that was it. Listen, between you and I, when we did drinks one evening, I found out the next morning that he also had some parking issues after our meetup as well.
Oh, so he tested his material ahead of time, didn't use it on you, elected to use it on me. Brad, if you're out there listening, we'll give you a chance for a little bit of rebuttal. The one thing I do love about Brad, though, he apologized for having UNLV season tickets, not saying he was willing to share that with our listeners. This coming from the same guy that says he's watched every New Mexico football game all season long. UNLV greater than New Mexico in the much maligned Mountain West pecking order. But hey, it's been outstanding. 11 or 12 great weeks. I can't even keep track of how many we've done this. And then the regular season finale show next week, which will, of course, share any potential scheduling updates. It's typically been where we combine the NFL and college. Similar scenario may play out. So for our loyal listeners, that's even more reason to follow the Bet the Board podcast for all of your podcast updates. If you haven't already done so, sign up and subscribe to the Bet the Board newsletter, a friendly reminder where all the additional information comes from and some additional bets that you can add to your portfolio each weekend. Speaking of portfolio, my good man, when it comes to investable opportunities this weekend in the college football realm, we had a long, and I mean long, lengthy debate about some of the potential candidates that we had considered. We went east. We went west. We went over, and that's not really true. We went under. First half, full game, and tried to figure it out. Since you get to be the judge, jury, and executioner, where did we ultimately land for this week's best wagering opportunity?
There's some games we've talked about on this podcast that just isn't there from a key number perspective. Maybe if that game were to get back to 3, we'd be intrigued by the big nightcap. And we've kind of went down this road previously where, Boise State was my favorite bet of the season, I feel like, and I just didn't get there because Brad was also on it, and we wanted to provide 2 pieces of information, and obviously, the best bet that week that we chose to go with didn't get there, although Boise State did, and I'm sure everyone who actually listened to the podcast and also bet Boise State that week. So it doesn't matter where the win comes from or who gets credited for it, but I feel like we shouldn't manufacture something, and this was a game that we've kind of talked about already, and Brad's on it, and got some confirmation that my guys are on it, and it's one, again, to the joke that we discussed when I asked you for your top 3, and you gave me 97, and then I forced you to give me 3.
I would have given you 105 if you let me, but I figured 97 was enough of a cap that I didn't want to get egregious and get in the triple digits.
Yeah, this was the game that you gave me that you liked, and it's 3-8-4 Utah State. So let's go with that as the best bet, Utah State. Just in my estimation, when I look at this, certainly something is amiss with San Jose State. Something is awry there, and just from a matchup perspective, what they are best at offensively is what San Jose State is best at defensively. I know, again, this is a game a little bit closer to you, so I will let you divulge and break this down. I won't steal your thunder.
When you look at San Jose State overall, I mean, it's a coach in Coach Brennan that I'm very high on, but to your point, something has transpired there, and it's always difficult to put your finger on the pulse of all 131 FBS teams. But when a team shows you who they are, you oftentimes have to take that at face value. And when you look at San Jose State, since their 40-7 win against UNLV that came in early October, the wheels have completely fallen off. You lose at Fresno State, 17-10 in a game you can't move the football with Logan Fife under center. That's a massive rivalry, relatively speaking, within the Mountain West for two teams in the Central Valley and the Bay Area. You drop that game. You follow it up with a 35-28 win against Nevada. But you know what the problem is, Payne? You're a 24.5-point favorite in that game. Total close is 44.5, and you give up 28 points to a Wolfpack team that hasn't done much of anything else. The common denominator in the game against Fresno, Nevada, Colorado State, and San Diego State, they just haven't been able to run the football. I mean, it has been downright abysmal, and they've trailed at the break in all of those games. Against Nevada, they were down. Against Colorado State, they were down. San Diego State, I thought they had cured everything. They get up 14-0, and they completely implode against Jalen Mauldin and what the Aztecs want to do. You give up 43 points in that spot. And to your point, talking about the way to beat Utah State, it's running the football right at them. San Jose State hasn't been able to do that, and I don't think that suddenly changes here. I look at Utah State. It's a team trending up. They've won 4 out of their last 5, as Brad talked about. They didn't have a ton of expectations coming into the year in the wake of getting to the conference championship last year, winning that and performing quite well in a bowl game. Suddenly you have 2 games left. 1 win gets you bowl eligible for a much maligned season. This is the spot they've had circled. They're saying the right things. Yes, I know they've lost some depth in the backfield. They lost Robert Briggs, who's their second leading rusher. But as I mentioned earlier, you get one of your more disruptive players potentially back on the defensive side. I just think it's a good spot. The weather Brad highlighted, so many different factors here. It's not a beauty pageant by any stretch of the imagination. You're going to have to wait all day to get involved. But Utah State, in my opinion, not only covers the short number as a 2-point dog, they can win this game on the football field. Don't love the travel coming back from Hawaii. Nobody ever does. But I think the coaches have highlighted that. They said it's not an excuse. They weren't happy with the second half. They played against the Rainbow Warriors, letting them hang around. I think you get a full 4-quarter effort here. And don't expect San Jose State to suddenly wave a magic wand and start playing their best football late in the year when they haven't shown it over a month now.
Like it. Let's get that important bowl victory, 6th win on Senior Day. Let's go again. Utah State plus the points here. Boy, that is a late game, 9:45. You're going to have to bring us home because I'm going to be fast asleep.
You'll be counting sheep. Don't lie. You're going to be up watching Oregon and Utah. I mean, I know that you can't resist a Pac-12 thriller that kicks off at 10:42 Eastern Time the night before your beloved NFL.
We are probably not going to be tuned into that one. We just need one more win, whether it comes against Oregon in upset fashion or it comes the following week. We need to get that 9th win for the win total. So hopefully it does happen, but I'm not going to be staying up. All right,
fine. You can get your beauty sleep. I know sometimes you don't have what it takes. You'll be all tired out, getting excited for the kickoff of the World Cup Sunday before the NFL with Qatar against Ecuador. I know that's where all of your attention will be. Follow Brad on Twitter at BradPower7. You, of course, can follow Payne there as well at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Furman. Follow me on social media. Most importantly, as always, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. And come Saturday late evening on the East Coast with a Utah State ticket in hand. Good things happen in Logan, Utah after dark. Hopefully we'll see you at the window.
Thanks for listening to Bet the Board. You can catch Todd and Payne every Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday during football season, breaking down the biggest NFL and college football games. And to make sure you don't miss any free best bets, subscribe to Bet the Board on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.